She stood in court silent and alone, accused of assaulting a white officer. But what if her silence wasn't guilt, but strategy? Why would a black woman choose to say nothing even when the system was trying to bury her? If that question pulls at you like it did us, tap, like share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that don't just entertain, they reveal. Now let me take you into a courtroom where silence wasn't weakness. It was the sharpest weapon of all. The courtroom felt colder than it should have been, not from the air conditioning, but from something heavier, like judgment had settled in the walls, watching everyone who walked through the doors. There she was, Sienna Blake. Black, mid to late 30s, slim frame hair tied back in a no-nonsense bun. She sat at the defense table, hands resting gently in her lap. Still not frozen, not nervous, just still. Still as if carved from focus itself. No twitch, no foot tapping, no shifting in her seat to make herself seem smaller. She sat tall, quiet, composed. The kind of silence that didn't shrink, it waited. Across the aisle, Officer Derek Landon leaned back in his chair, white mid-40s. The kind of man who carried his badge like it was a crown. Crisp uniform square jaw, that small, smug curve at the edge of his mouth. He didn't even look at the jury, just stared straight ahead like the verdict was already in his favor. Sienna didn't look at him, didn't look at the jury either. Her eyes rested on the judge's bench, still and steady. A woman in the jury box tilted her head, whispered to the man next to her, "Why isn't she saying anything?" He shrugged. "Looks cold, probably knows she's guilty." And just like that, without evidence or context, a silence had become a sentence. The judge entered, all rise. The shuffle of chairs, the scraping of shoes. The room straightened like a held breath. Landon stood confidently, hands behind his back. Chin slightly raised, he'd told this story before. And from the look on his face, he didn't expect it to be challenged today either. Sienna rose slowly, deliberately. No performance, no protest, just presence. This wasn't just another court case. This was about how people see what they expect to see. And in this room, with its polished wood and powdered wigs of decorum, expectations were already deciding everything. Sienna hadn't said a word yet, but somehow her silence was louder than anything else in that room. Officer Derek Landon adjusted his collar as he stepped into the witness box like a man preparing not to testify, but to perform. He carried himself with the kind of ease that only comes when you believe the room is already on your side. The oath was given. He didn't stumble. And when the prosecutor asked for his account, Landon didn't hesitate. He painted the picture carefully. Late at night, a federal building, a woman pacing alone. Agitated. He said the word agitated more than once. The boy Tim John leaned forward, pens ready. They weren't writing facts, they were absorbing a narrative. Landon's voice dropped lower as he described approaching her, how she refused to identify herself, how her tone was defensive, how her posture made him concerned. He didn't shout, he didn't accuse. He simply repeated the phrase like a chorus. "I feared for my safety," 3 times at maybe 4. Each time slower, as if the weight of those words made them more real. At the defense table, Sienna didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't shift. She stared ahead as though she'd heard this story before. Many times. The jury didn't notice her silence this time. They were too focused on Landon's calm, steady voice, too ready to believe the man in uniform with practiced eyes and confident pauses. And maybe that was the point. He didn't need to raise his voice. He had the benefit of expectation. One juror, an older man with silver glasses, nodded slightly, pen tapping in rhythm with Landon's testimony. Another scribbled furiously as if the details were undeniable. But they weren't details. They were brushstrokes carefully placed to make Sienna look like a threat, without ever saying the word. Landon ended his account with a breath that sounded rehearsed, just the right hint of burden. Like the moment had weighed on him more than anyone else. Sienna still hadn't spoken, still hadn't reacted. But the room, it was starting to lean. Not because of evidence, but because of a story told just convincingly enough to make a lie feel like law. The prosecutor rose slowly, a practiced rhythm in his steps, like a man who knew when to let silence do the work. He adjusted his cuffs, looked to the jury with that subtle, rehearsed glance that says, "Trust me," before turning toward the defense table. His voice was calm, but laced with something colder. "Miss Blake, are you associated with any activist organizations?" The question landed sharp, not because it was direct, but because it wasn't necessary. Sienna didn't respond. She wasn't required to not yet, but the way the question lingered said more than the words themselves. Devin, her court-appointed attorney, shifted uncomfortably beside her, young overwhelmed, still thumbing through legal pads like the answers might magically appear. He cleared his throat. Objection relevance. The judge looked up slowly. No firm reprimand, no urgency, just a brief pause. Overruled, he said, 3 syllables that carried more weight than they should. The prosecutor didn't stop there. Do you often record law enforcement encounters, Miss Blake? Do you train others to do so? No foundation, no evidence. Just questions designed to paint a picture. Sienna blinked once, but otherwise didn't move. Her silence wasn't defiance, it was preservation. But in a courtroom where silence can be twisted into guilt, that distinction was already being lost. A murmur rose from the back row. Someone whispered, just barely audible, "She's got an attitude." It wasn't the words themselves. It was the tone, that slow, dismissive drawl used for women who don't shrink, who don't apologize for occupying space. And just like that, the narrative shifted again, not because of proof, but because of perception. Devin leaned toward her, whispered something quick and uncertain. She didn't answer. Instead, she kept her eyes forward, past the judge, past the prosecutor, past the room full of people watching her, like a threat waiting to happen. She knew what this was. It wasn't about guilt, it was about control, about reminding a quiet black woman that even silence could be punished. The jury didn't speak, but their pens moved, writing down bias disguised as observation. The prosecutor smiled faintly, as if he'd already won the round. And maybe for that moment, he had Devin sat slumped over his case file, elbows resting on a desk that felt too big, too polished for someone barely 3 years out of law school. He wasn't built for this kind of case. He knew that. And after today's hearing, he was starting to think no one wanted him to be. The prosecutor had buried him in a tone, not evidence. The jury wasn't just doubting Sienna, they were doubting him. He glanced at her file again. Thin too, then a standard background check, a birth certificate, no criminal record, and 1 job line under employment, classified. He blinked. That couldn't be right. He checked again. No wage to classified, no company name, no military affiliation, no clearance level, just redacted. His email pinged. Then his phone buzzed an encrypted message. He hadn't signed up for anything encrypted. He didn't even know he had an encrypted inbox. Unknown sender, no subject. "She's not who you think, ask about Operation Echo Pulse." He froze. There were 2 kinds of silence in a courtroom, the one Sienna used like armor, and the kind Devin felt now when something you thought was simple suddenly cracks. He typed the phrase into the Internal Justice Network, Operation Echo Pulse, nothing. Then he used a workaround, an old academic login from his Georgetown days patched through a faculty server. Boom, went in, results sealed file. Access denied, red band top and bottom, restricted level 5 clearance required. Devin sat back, his breath shallow. "Who the hell are you, Sienna Blake?" He opened the court file again, scanned every line. Her place of birth, her education. All ordinary. But then he saw it, a line hidden under employment history, barely visible. Previous affiliations, internal strategic ops, cross-reference clearance, TSSCI. Top secret, sensitive compartmented information. He swallowed. Only Pentagon intelligence or covert field operators had that kind of tag. "This isn't just a case," he muttered. "This is a wall someone built on purpose." He looked up from the screen, his heart ticking louder than the courthouse clock. Was she a spy, a black op-ed handler? No, that wasn't the question anymore. The real question was, why would someone like that choose to stay silent, even while being publicly humiliated in court? It came in quiet. No sirens, no announcements, just a soft ping on Devin's phone. A message from an unknown number. Again, this time it had an attachment. "I recorded this from my balcony that night. She deserves for people to see the truth." Devin tapped the file. It was shaky phone footage, low light but unmistakable. Sienna standing, still, both hands clearly visible, palms open by her sides. She didn't move. She didn't speak. Then came the officer. "Sorry, and Landon," was her assertion. In the frame now, stepping toward her fast, too fast. His voice cut through the grainy audio like a slap. "Don't play smart with me." He moved closer, his face inches from hers. "Women like you need to learn." Then just like that, he shoved her. Hard her back hit the brick wall behind her. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She just absorbed it. Silent still. Devin's breath caught in his throat. He stood up mid-session, holding his phone like a torch. "Your Honor," he said, voice shaking but steady. "The defense respectfully requests permission to present new video evidence sent by an eyewitness moments ago." The prosecutor shot up. "Objection. This was not submitted during discovery. This is ambush evidence." The judge leaned forward, eyebrows knitting. "Mr. Carter, we received it just now. Civilians have a right to submit proof, especially when it contradicts sworn testimony." The prosecutor protested again, louder this time, but the judge raised a hand. "Enough, I'll allow it." Silence swept through the courtroom like wind before a storm. The lights dimmed, a projector flickered on. All eyes turned forward. The video played. Again, the courtroom saw her, Sienna. Not a threat, not a suspect, just a woman standing quietly under a flickering streetlight. Then Landon appeared, angry, loud, accusing her before she had even spoken. The shove came abrupt, brutal, final. It hit harder on screen than in real life because now everyone saw it. The jury recoiled. One woman covered her mouth, another man stoic, until now blinked rapidly, then wiped at the corner of his eye. In the back row, someone whispered through clenched teeth, "That's assault." The prosecutor stayed frozen, lips pressed into a pale line. At the plaintiff's table, Landon looked away. He didn't blink, but his jaw clenched. He knew the mask had slipped. Sienna remained still. But for the first time since the trial began, someone else broke the silence for her. The lights came back on. No one spoke. The video had said what no lawyer could do, and now it was time for Landon to answer. He took the stand again, not as calm this time, not as clean. His shoulders were tighter. His eyes darted just enough to betray what his mouth hadn't said yet. Devin stood slowly, holding only a single sheet of paper. He didn't need notes anymore. "Officer Landon," he began, voice cool, "you told this courtroom you feared for your safety." Landon nodded stiffly. "Yes. You said the defendant was aggressive, that her behavior was threatening." "Yes, ma'am." Devin stepped closer, calm, controlled. "And yet the jury has now seen the video where she's standing, still, hands down, silent." A pause, heavy. "So let me ask again, officer." Devin leaned in, slightly, eyes locked. "You felt threatened by someone standing still." The words hit the room like a crack across glass. Landon shifted, his mouth twitched. "That's not the point," he snapped. "I acted on instinct. That's protocol. We don't wait for threats to explode. We prevent them." By shoving an unarmed woman into a wall, Devin's tone didn't rise, but the weight behind it did. Landon's face flushed. "I don't need to justify my actions to you. I did my job." His voice cracked, not from emotion, but from ego. A murmur ran through the gallery. It wasn't shock anymore. It was recognition. One juror, a woman in her 60s, glanced toward Sienna, then turned her eyes away. She didn't need to say it out loud. From somewhere near the back, a quiet voice broke the stillness. "We've seen this before, haven't we?" Just 6 words, but they tore through the courtroom louder than any shout. Devin stepped back, letting the silence speak, because now it wasn't about whether Landon told the truth. It was about how many times people like him had told that story and how many times others had believed it. At the plaintiff's table, Landon gripped the edge of his chair, knuckles white. And across from him, Sienna remained still. But her stillness no longer felt like retreat. Now it felt like a mirror. And Landon was cracking. The judge had barely returned from recess when a hand rose quietly from the gallery. "Your Honor, may I approach the bench?" It came from a man in uniform. Trim haircut, pressed jacket, presence of command. The judge hesitated. "State your name and purpose." "Colonel Vincent Reyes, retired former director of Strategic Threat Response. I carry an authorization from the Department of Defense." He stepped forward. From his jacket, he produced a sealed folder with a gold Pentagon stamp. The courtroom shifted. Even the prosecutor looked up, confused. Devin froze. The judge opened the folder, scanned, then looked at the man and finally at Sienna. "Proceed, Colonel." Reyes turned to the jury. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I'm not here to make a scene, but I can no longer stay silent while this woman is treated like a criminal." He looked towards Sienna, not as a witness, but as a soldier looks to a commander. Sienna Blake once led Operation Echo Pulse, the most classified intel fusion mission in CENTCOM's modern history. Gasps scattered across the room. She oversaw tactical threat analysis for 5 regions. Her work prevented 2 embassy attacks and stopped a nuclear threat in the Horn of Africa. A few jurors sat straighter. She saved lives, mine included. I wouldn't be standing here if it weren't for her decisions made in dark rooms thousands of miles away. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a small laminated photo, and handed it to the clerk. The screen flickered on a grainy photo appeared. Sienna in full dress uniform, standing beside a 4-star general. A medal gleaming on her chest, Legion of Merit. The room fell into stunned silence. The same woman they thought too silent, too defensive, had once been the shield behind half a dozen missions they'd never hear about. Reyes looked out across the room. She never asked for recognition, and she sure as hell didn't expect to be shoved into a wall in her own country. Then softer. We don't need a monta. She's not just a citizen, she's a guardian. The prosecutor said nothing. There was nothing left to say. And for the first time, the jury didn't just look at Sienna. They saw her. One man even stood, not out of protest but respect. Devon's eyes brimmed. He turned to Sienna, whispering, "Why didn't you say any of this?" She replied barely above a breath, "Because I wanted them to see me as a person before they found out I was a soldier. And now they did." The judge looked across the courtroom. "Miss Blake, if you have anything to say before we adjourn, this is your moment." For a heartbeat, Sienna didn't move. Then slowly she rose from her seat. Not rushed, not dramatic. She walked to the center of the room. No notes, no podium, just her voice. And when she spoke, it wasn't loud, but it cut through the air like glass. "I served in silence, I returned to silence. But silence shouldn't be mistaken for guilt." The room stilled. "I didn't ask for a salute, I asked for dignity." She looked toward the jury not with anger, but with gravity. "I was labeled a threat because I asked a question. I was shoved against a wall, because I stood still. But I've seen walls before. And the strongest ones don't fall with shouting. They fall when the truth stands taller." Devon watched her still, his hands gripping the edge of the table. Colonel Reyes stood at attention, not as obligation, but as respect. In the gallery, a little girl leaned toward her mother and whispered, "Mama, why didn't she yell?" Her mother didn't blink, just whispered back, "Because truth doesn't need to scream." And in that moment, you could feel it. The shift, not just in verdicts, but in understanding. Because sometimes it's not the loudest voice that changes the room. It's the quietest one that refuses to break. And Sienna Blake had never broken. The jury filed back into the courtroom. Their faces were solemn, but something in their eyes had softened. Not pity, not guilt. Something quieter. Understanding. The judge cleared his throat. "Madam Foreperson, has the jury reached a verdict?" The woman stood. She looked over at Sienna just for a second, then at the judge. "We have your honor." Dombreno. She unfolded the paper with steady fingers. "On the charge of obstructing a peace officer, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of resisting arrest, not guilty." There was no gasp, no shout, only the slow release of breath. Like the room itself had been holding it in for hours. Then one juror, a man in his 70s, stood up. His voice was rough, quiet, but clear. "We failed her before, not this time." No one stopped him because no one wanted to. The judge looked down at the bench. Then up again, his voice for the first time trembled slightly. "Ms. Blake, this court owes you more than a verdict." He paused, swallowed. "It owes you an apology." Silence again. But this time it wasn't heavy, it was reverent. Devon looked over at Sienna. She nodded once, barely noticeable. But it held more grace than any outburst ever could. Landon didn't speak. He didn't move. The man who once called her a threat now couldn't hold her gaze. And as the gavel struck for the final time, it didn't sound like judgment. It sounded like release. Because justice isn't just about proving innocence. It's about recognizing what should never have been questioned in the first place. And that day in that room, Sienna Blake was no longer just heard, she was believed. The courtroom doors opened, and the world outside was already waiting. Cameras, reporters, flashbulbs like lightning questions flew from every direction. "Miss Blake, were you framed? Do you plan to sue the department? How does it feel to finally be heard?" But Sienna Blake didn't answer. She stepped out slowly, head high, shoulders relaxed, no press conference, no speech. Just quiet footsteps past the microphones as if she was walking away from something and towards something more important. Devon caught up to her on the courthouse steps. "Hey," he called, breathless. She turned, eyebrow raised just slightly. "Now that the world knows," he said, "what's next?" Sienna paused, the crowd behind her, still murmuring, cameras still flashing. Then she smiled, not wide, not for show, just enough to be real. "They don't need to know who I was. They just need to remember what I stood for." She turned and kept walking. Across the street, a young black girl stood beside her mother, gripping her hand. The girl whispered, "Mama, was she a hero?" The mother looked down at her daughter, then at Sienna's retreating figure, and said gently, "No, that's what strength looks like. The girl kept watching, not because of the uniform, not because of the case, but because she had just seen a woman refuse to shout for justice and still be heard louder than anyone else. And maybe that was the real legacy. Not medals, not titles, but the reminder that dignity doesn't demand attention. It walks right through the noise and leaves silence stronger than applause. Sometimes the most powerful voices aren't the ones that shout. They're the ones that choose to stand steady and unshaken, even in silence. Sienna's story reminds us that dignity isn't granted by a title or a badge or a medal. It comes from knowing who you are and standing up for what's right, even when the world doubts you. If this story moved you, even just for a moment, please give it a like. Share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Mr. Mac's Stories for more true-to-heart storytelling that matters. Your support helps our small creative team keep doing what we love, bringing you stories that inspire challenge and stay with you long after the video ends. Because here at Mr. Mac's Stories, we don't just tell stories, we shine a light on what should never be forgotten. Thanks for watching and for listening with your heart.